what happens is that this whiteness ticket becomes the winning ticket because it's able to incorporate not only Europeans who had been warring, Pole versus German, British versus German, German versus Russian, Hungarian versus Romanian, Ukrainian versus Lithuanian, Serb versus Croat, Northern Italian versus Southern Italian. I mean, all of these different European ethnicities, they adopt a new sort of militarized identity politics, which makes it even more curious that there are those who are defined as white today in the United States. They're always accusing other groups of engaging in identity politics. They don't. Matter of fact, identity politics even came to surmount the barrier of religion because Jewish Americans, excuse me, Jewish people who had been hounded, as noted by the Iberians, were incorporated into the hallowed halls of whiteness, even though England had expelled this Jewish population at the end of the 13th century. But under siege, it began to incorporate Jewish Americans. And of course, Jewish Americans, excuse me, incorporate Jewish people. I'm so accustomed to using the term Jewish American. Incorporated Jewish people into this new identity politics to the point where Jewish Americans were a significant part of the U.S. ruling class and were essential to the building of settler colonialism because whiteness also was a way to confront a rebellious indigenous population and keep the Africans in line. You needed all those who you could muster who were defined as white, unquote. China's going to have to get involved because the sly and diabolical Mr. Erdogan also facilitated the transport to the battlefield of Syria of many Uyghurs, for example, from Western China, many Uzbeks from China's neighbors in former Soviet Central Asia. And obviously, this may have the advantage of convincing Mr. Trump that part of his program of focusing like a laser beam on China can also incorporate Syria, because you can train warriors on the battlefield of Syria who can then be transported back to Western China and can create quite a headache for the People's Republic of China. But in any case, I see this China sitting on its hands as being a short-lived process, because already there are rumblings about the Taiwan Straits, for example. And I think that that's going to be the next flashpoint after Ukraine, after Syria, next the Taiwan Straits.
All right, good day, everyone. We are here today again with our favorite professor, Professor Gerald Horne, and I don't think he needs any introduction. We are going to talk a little bit about what we are seeing today in West Asia, and a question that has been really in my mind, and that is actually triggered by things you have said, but also things you have written in your books, and that is about the idea of white supremacy back in the day being the winning ticket in the inter-imperialist competition between, for example, Catholic Spain and England. And I was wondering, when we see what's happening in Syria right now, you've often discussed, Professor Horne, how white supremacy has historically outcompeted other forms of unity, such as religious unity, and how it played a significant role in shaping global dynamics. Now, today we see a lot of divisions in various regions, such as Georgia, Syria, China, often playing into the hands of US imperialism. But despite these divisions that we see all over the world, the West appears remarkably unified. Even when it comes to supporting a genocide, pretty much no one in the Western club has genuinely resisted or disconnected themselves from what is going on. So my question is, Could you maybe elaborate on whether you believe that even today white supremacy continues to be the winning ticket that maintains this absolute unity that we see today in the West?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. Second of all, I see this inauthentic unity as fragmenting. And I see that partially as a product of this crisis of white supremacy. So I'll begin at the current moment, and then I'll reel back a few centuries. What I mean by the current moment is that if you look at the United States of America, the heavyweight champion of white supremacy, the big dog of the imperialist count, the slogan that has propelled Mr. Trump once again into the White House, "Make America Great Again," is an implicit recognition that the United States is not so great today, and that there needs to be a recalibration, there needs to be a return to some Eden-like garden, for example. And therefore, you begin to see a fragmentation. You see that particularly here in North America with this rather bold and audacious maneuver by Mr. Trump to diminish Canada, which shares a lengthy border with the United States. Canada, by some measures, is the second largest nation on planet Earth to Russia in terms of control of territory. But Mr. Trump, because he perceives that there is a weakness to US imperialism, particularly vis-a-vis its competition with the People's Republic of China, has talked openly about turning this so-called ally into a neo-colonial appendage. If you look at his Truth Social posts, that is to say, the analog to his X or Twitter posts, he's referred contemptuously to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau as Governor Justin Trudeau, a governor, says Mr. Trump, of the great state of Canada, which he has referred to as the 51st state of the United States of America. We're talking about a member of the Group of Seven, a leading imperialist country, a mining superpower. But Mr. Trump is trying to diminish Canada and is willing to wreck the Canadian economy through imposing tariffs on this country in order to compel Canada to bend the knee to US imperialism. I would also interpret the recent trade agreement between the European Union and Mercosur, which is this South American trading bloc led by Brazil, in that same context, because it's no secret that Mr. Trump has instructed the Western European countries, particularly the members of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which includes Britain and France, that unless they spend more on buying weapons from the US military-industrial complex, then the United States may be compelled to withdraw from NATO. And of course, he's also talked about slapping tariffs on the Western European nations. It's obvious that what Mr. Trump has in mind when he calls tariffs the most beautiful word in the language, that he feels that he can cut taxes on his billionaire backers. There are headlines today in the US press about how the fortune of Elon Musk, the apartheid South Africa-born billionaire, has increased by a few $100 billion since Election Day on November 5th, 2024. And so the idea is you cut taxes on the billionaires in the United States and you raise tariffs on the so-called allies. You convert them fundamentally into neo-colonial appendages of the United States of America. And in fact, John Bolton, who was the national security advisor under Mr. Trump during his first administration, says in his memoir that Mr. Trump saw the European Union as second to China as a threat to U.S. hegemony. And the European Union is supposedly the ally. And mentioning China, of course, raises the obvious point that Mr. Trump feels a bit insecure when it comes to competing with the People's Republic of China. Now, this is a dilemma made in USA because if you look at the history of U.S.-China relations, and your mind reels back to this three-cornered conflict between the Soviet Union, China, and the United States of America, what happens, to put it summarily, is that in order to win over the People's Republic of China on a more blatant anti-Soviet basis, what happens is that the United States engineers the pouring of massive foreign direct investment into China, which has created this juggernaut. In fact, you can even pinpoint the moment when that begins to happen. That is January 1979, when Paramount leader Deng Xiaoping makes a 9-day visit to the United States of America. According to biographical accounts and other accounts, Mr. Deng Xiaoping studies the United States intensely and intensively before traveling. When he gets to Houston, he dons a cowboy hat to ingratiate himself with the ruling elite of Texas, for example. And then he comes back to China, and by February 1979, you have China waging war on its purported, alleged, supposed communist comrade, speaking of Vietnam, which thrills Washington. It convinces Washington that China is on side, that China is on board. And even before that, in 1975, and I mentioned that this because Mr. Biden, the current incumbent, visited Angola, Southwest Africa, just a few days ago. And recall that during the struggle for independence in that Southwest African nation, which, by the way, was a major contributor to the African slave trade to North America. In fact, my sister tells me that our family is actually of Angolan ancestry, for example. In any case, during the struggle for independence against Portuguese colonialism in 1975, there was this conflict internally with the Soviet Union and Cuba backing one side, the victorious side, the Popular Movement for the Liberation of Angola, whose leader, President Lorenzo, greeted Mr. Biden in Luanda just a few days ago. And then there were these other factions, one backed by apartheid South Africa, U.S. imperialism, and the People's Republic of China. I'm speaking of UNITA, the Union for the Total Independence of Angola, headed by Jonas Savimbi, greeted more than once by Ronald Wilson Reagan himself in the White House. And China was supporting Mr. Savimbi in no small measure because he was being opposed by the Soviet Union. And that also helps to convince of Washington that China is reliable. And so after this Angola escapade and the conflict with Vietnam, massive foreign direct investment pours into China, and giving this collaboration a certain authenticity. Appointed as U.S. ambassador to China to engineer the floating of entire industrial plants across the across the Pacific to China, was Leonard Woodcock, the leader of the United Auto Workers, for example. He becomes United States ambassador to China as the United States is successively deindustrialized and China is built up because the capitalist class wants to take advantage, as they see it, of the cheap labor of the People's Republic of China. Now, obviously, we know the rest of the story has created this juggernaut that is now threatening U.S. supremacy. And by the way, leading to a very perilous circumstance in the Taiwan Straits, because you should not expect the United States to accept its fate uh, in a lethargic fashion. It will fight to, let's say, to the last Chinese in order to ensure that it remains the big dog on planet Earth. And I raise this in part because it reminds me of a similar transition. Now I make this shift to what happened centuries ago that helps to explain why myself sitting here in Honolulu, Hawaii, and yourselves sitting in Hong Kong are speaking this language, English, that has roots in Northwestern Europe. And the story is told in my book, The Dawning of the Apocalypse, which deals with the 16th century. What happens, as any school child can tell you, is that in 1492, Columbus sails the ocean blue, sponsored by the Spanish, who had just escaped 700 years of domination by the Arab world, and at the same time was knee deep in religious sectarianism, that is to say, the Inquisition, whereby the Catholics would torture, if not liquidate, the Jewish minority and even Muslims if they would not.
Can I just quickly interrupt, Professor Horn? There's something going wrong with the lighting. Sometimes your screen is completely black. So what I think is good to do is actually to lower your camera a bit more, so the camera is not aiming at the light the other way. Yeah, so that it's not aiming at the light on the ceiling, because now it's great.
So
So we were
I'll
talking
pick up.
about Columbus, 1492.
Right, right, right. And so and so um, so the Spanish are they are enmeshed and immersed in the one true faith, that is to say, Catholicism, for example, which 1400 years earlier had taken a good deal of the world by storm. And what happens is that as Columbus crosses the Atlantic, part of the project supposedly is to win souls from, that is to say, to convert the indigenous of the Americas to Catholicism, of course, uh, exploiting their labor and seizing their resources is also part of the agenda, including the vast resources of Peru in particular, and Mexico also, not to mention the Caribbean, what is now Cuba, for example. And what happens is that by 1517, this is a few decades after Columbus sails the ocean blue, you have the Martin Luther eruption in what is now Germany, a rebellion against the Catholic Church. And I analogize the Martin Luther eruption to the Chinese divergence from the Soviet Union. That is to say, when Protestantism, as it's called, sweeps into London a few years later under Henry VIII, it takes England by storm, but that helps to ignite a round robin of conflict between the Protestants and the Catholics, not unlike the conflict between the Soviet Union and China. And so what happens, of course, is that there is another player in this game, which is Ottoman Turkey, which is competing effectively with the Catholics. In fact, there's reasons to suspect that when the Iberians, the Spanish, begin to dispatch forces across the Atlantic, in some ways they're retreating from the incoming rush of Muslims. They feel they need more backup. They feel they need more substantiation. So what happens, to make a long story short, is that London begins to cut deals with the Muslims. And obviously, Ottoman Turkey underestimated London. In fact, a turning point in terms of England's ascension with regard to supremacy, which comes in no small measure because of its ability to enslave Africans. And the latter stems heavily from the events of 1591, when London collaborates with what we would call the Moroccans against the southern neighbors of the Moroccans, speaking of the Songhai Empire in today's Mali, destabilizing the Songhai Empire, which has knock-on effects and repercussions, cascading further south, softening up Africa for the African slave trade, which then London is able to take advantage of in order to get free labor to develop Barbados and Jamaica, which it seizes from Spain in the first few decades of the 17th century. And this sugar boom, of course, sends wealth cascading into London, because sugar is seen as not only a way to sweeten your tea and coffee, it's seen as a miracle drug, believe it or not. And that allows London to accumulate enough wealth to progressively undermine the Catholic powers, because what happens is that the Catholic powers rely upon what we can call prosaically the old-time religion. In order to be a settler in Florida, which they capture from the indigenous in 1565, you have to be Catholic. Whereas the scrappy underdogs, speaking of London, it moves towards race. That is to say, those who had been warring on the shores of Europe, in the first instance, English versus Irish, English versus Scots, English versus Welsh, when they cross the Atlantic, magically, they're rebranded as, quote, white, unquote. We see rebranding taking place in Damascus, where an Al-Qaeda affiliate is now rebranded as sort of an epitome of diversity. And soon they'll be called an LBGT ally, for example. That's what rebranding is all about. And so what happens is that this whiteness ticket becomes the winning ticket, because it's able to incorporate not only Europeans who had been warring, Pole versus German, British versus German, German versus Russian, Hungarian versus Romanian, Ukrainian versus Lithuanian, Serb versus Croat, Northern Italian versus Southern Italian. I mean, all of these different European ethnicities, they adopt a new sort of militarized identity politics, which makes it even more curious that there are those who are defined as white today in the United States that are always accusing other groups of engaging in identity politics. They don't. Matter of fact, identity politics even came to surmount the barrier of religion, because Jewish Americans, Jewish people who had been hounded, as noted, by the Iberians, were incorporated into the hallowed halls of whiteness, even though England had expelled this Jewish population at the end of the 13th century. But under siege, it began to incorporate Jewish Americans. And of course, incorporate Jewish people. I'm so accustomed to using the term Jewish American. Incorporating Jewish people into this new identity politics, to the point where Jewish Americans were a significant part of the U.S. ruling class and were essential to the building of settler colonialism, because whiteness also was a way to confront a rebellious indigenous population and keep the Africans in line. You needed all those who you could muster who were defined as white, unquote. And ultimately, it incorporates many Lebanese Christians, for example, like Ralph Nader, for example, the presidential hopeful. It incorporates Egyptian Christians, such as Hoda. I'm not sure how to pronounce her name. It's spelled Kotb. She's a comrade of Jenna Bush on television in the United States until recently. Jenna Bush being the daughter of former U.S. President George W. Bush. But basically, the only qualification for being incorporated into whiteness, at least in the early stages, if you were Arab, for example, would be if you're part of the Arab Christian minority and were sufficiently melanin deficient. And then if you could speak English without an accent and with a US accent, all the better, for example. And in fact, Queen Noor of Jordan, the spouse of the late king before Abdullah, King Hussein, uh, she was of Syrian Christian descent. The former Lisa Halaby, Halaby. Her father was a leader of a now defunct airline, Pan American Airways. But anyway, I'm digressing from the major theme, which is how uh, Anglo American whiteness becomes the winning ticket, sweeping the globe, helping to explain why so many of us are speaking English, why so many have English as their second language, why the dollar has become the international reserve currency, replacing in many ways the British pound. But alas, that stitch up is now enmeshed in a severe crisis given the rise of the People's Republic of China, which again is analogous to how London began to rise in the 1500s when it cut a deal with the Muslims underestimating this minor kingdom on the fringes of Europe, just like I think it's fair to say that the United States underestimated China when they began pouring all this capital into China. They thought that they could take advantage of Chinese labor forevermore and that China would be on side. It reminds me of a saying you oftentimes hear from immigrant groups in the United States, which is that the United States feels that it's using these groups, just like it feels that it was using China against the Soviet Union, just like it feels that it's using Al Qaeda against secular forces or using Al Qaeda against Russia, for example, which is seen as a loser in the recent Syrian conflict. But you can make an argument that these forces are actually using the United States of America for their own purposes, for example. And that's certainly true with regard to the People's Republic of China, because even though in the short term, the United States was successful in, quote, using, unquote, China, in the long term, it's not so clear, to the point where, once again, we at the present moment are involved in a general crisis of white supremacy. And for those looking for further substantiation, I've written at length on this subject. Just put my name into your favorite search engine, and you'll be able to come up with reams of articles and, in fact, substantiating books on this topic.
Well, I just want to correct your history a little bit there. You suggest that all this FDI went from the US into China because US capitalists were greedy. That doesn't accord with the way that US politicians are talking nowadays. So the reality was the China sent the PLA to all these corporate boardrooms and at the point of an AK-47 forced all these CEOs to send their factories over to China. So clearly that's that's the reality. Um, no, but in all seriousness, I don't know if this is hijacking the conversation a little bit too much in a different direction, but the sense I get of a lot of people right now in this moment with so many crises ongoing from, you know, the longest term, most dire, the ecological crisis to the, you know, I don't even know what temporal frame to put it in, the nuclear crisis, which the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists say is worse now than it was during the height of the Cold War, to the ongoing genocide, to just, you know, wars breaking out, and we expect more to break out as the ecological crisis gets worse. Can you, my sense is that a lot of people are disheartened and just kind of enervated by this whole depressing scenario. I'm wondering if you as a historian can uh, have better, you know, have more perspective and see that the present moment, while seeming very dire doesn't hold a candle to perhaps other moments in the past and maybe provide some perspective to people who are feeling uh like there's no point in struggle.
Well, you need to only inspect my visage. That is to say, a person of African descent speaking this language developed in Northwestern Europe, speaking of English, a product, a descendant of the unlamented African slave trade, which from the 1500s until the abolition of slavery in Brazil in 1888 transported millions of Africans across the Atlantic to work for free and develop the United States in the first instance, and also left at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean millions more who either were tossed overboard during slave revolts or committed suicide in order to escape this inglorious fate. Uh, it's not as if the past was some sort of Garden of Eden, and now we're entering some sort of diabolical present. In fact, you can make an argument that from the 1500s up until today, to a degree, there has been progress. I mean, I'm happy to say that the African slave trade was abolished, slavery was abolished, uh, the involuntary coercion of Africans to be marched at gunpoint across the Atlantic. Uh, that inglorious process has diminished. But at the same time, I don't want to diminish at all what you just outlined in terms of creeping ever closer to nuclear midnight, in terms of the environmental catastrophe. But I think that the point that helps to give us optimism, at least gives me optimism, is that my own opinion is that the imperialist camp is in decline for reasons I've just sketched. The imperialist camp led by the United States of America. And I would like to think that in order for China and its allies in the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, to compete with the imperialist camp during this transition moment, they have to offer better deals to the global majority, which won't be that difficult given that the imperialist camp routinely uh, exploits shamelessly the global majority. They feel that's part of their birthright. You see this, for example, to take one a microcosmic example, this recent Biden trip to Angola. Uh, he comes to Angola because Angola's trade with China is 8 times larger than the United States trade with China. He comes to Angola because China had built infrastructure, uh, that substantial infrastructure. In fact, when a good deal of the airports that Vice President Harris landed in during her trip to Africa a few months previous, Accra, Ghana, Lusaka, Zambia, Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, were all designed and or subsidized by Chinese interests. And so Mr. Biden comes to Angola to christen the Libido corridor, which in many ways is just another neo-colonial escapade because it's a railway that allows the shipping of minerals from Congo and Zambia and Angola itself to Atlantic ports to be then shipped across the United States, shipped across the Atlantic to the United States. Now, on the one hand, it's a neo-colonial escapade. On the other hand, it does build this railway, which can then be used to transport people, which can then mean the further integration of the economies of Angola, Congo, and Zambia. But at the same time, it's competing with the Tanzam Railway, which China built during the Mao era in the mid-1970s, which goes from the copper fields of Zambia to the Indian Ocean port of Dar es Salaam. which once again not only transports minerals, but its infrastructure that's now being refurbished by China as we speak. And so now, hopefully, the moment we're in is this competition between the imperialist camp led by the United States and the BRICS camp led by China, with the emphasis not only on extraction of minerals, but also building infrastructure, which ultimately is important for these economies. That is to say, railways, for example, a railway in Ethiopia, the second most populous country on the African continent, from the heart of Ethiopia to the Red Sea, which allows for, once again, further integration, the building of airports, the building of bridges, for example, the sponsoring of scholarships. In fact, even Turkey, which is obviously feeling that it can revive the Ottoman Empire, particularly given its recent, quote, triumph, unquote, in Syria, is playing a major role in Somalia. It's educating many Somali students, and that's a byproduct of this era of exploitation. That is to say, trying to educate African students. The United States was involved in the same process. I'm sitting here in Honolulu, recall that it was during that time when the United States was competing with the Soviet Union that Barack Obama Sr. came from Kenya to study at the University of Hawaii. And then the rest is history in terms of his fathering a child who becomes US president. So I would like to think that the bad old days of the African slave trade, the bad old days of colonialism, which involved extraction almost exclusively, we're now in a new phase with regard to relations with the poorest continent, speaking of Africa, which involves the building of infrastructure, which involves the education of youth. And I don't want to be accused of being a Pollyanna, however, but what I'm saying is actually factual. And I would also add this point too, which is that my own opinion is, my own estimate is that just like the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, put paid to both the African slave trade and the enslavement of Africans, because London in particular and France, the primary victim, came to realize that a significant price had to be paid with regard to slavery. You could lose your life. More importantly, you could lose your investments, which is what happened with the Haitian Revolution. That led to a general crisis of the entire slave system that then manifests in the United States by 1865 and Brazil by 1888. And I would like to think that in the 20th century, with the Bolshevik Revolution, which in turn causes the United States a few decades later to try to cut all of these deals with the Chinese Revolution, 1949, illustrates another general crisis where you see a devolution, I would argue, of the imperialist camp, the capitalist camp, and now we're in the phase where they're scrambling to try to reverse the tides of history. But just like the United States scrambled to reverse the tides of history in the 19th century, that is to say, the tides of history unleashed by the Haitian Revolution, and proved to be unsuccessful in that regard, I dare say the United States will also prove to be unsuccessful in reversing the tides of history unleashed in the 20th century. Now, once again, I'm willing to absorb the criticism that that is an overly optimistic reading of an entirely perilous moment, as Peter has sketched. But I do think that there is some factual basis for that analysis.
Yeah, so I really want to jump in on to jump on that point where you say, okay, you are actually saying like, okay, that probably you cannot change the tide anymore, and U.S. imperialism is in serious decline. But there's another sentiment lately, and that is with the fall of Syria. that many people are actually saying, forget it. We overestimated the decline of the United States, and US imperialism has been very, very victorious again. And Israel is now expanding its territory. There are actually no more independent Arab states. I mean, let's also acknowledge that there's pretty much no more really independent Arab states. Um, so how do you see that? Do you also see that what's happening in Syria as a big victory for US imperialism? And add to that, lots of people are also saying that China, there's a big lack of involvement of China, and United States is actually getting closer and closer now. How do you see that as well?
Well, I'm old enough to remember 1989 when the Soviet Union was driven out of Afghanistan after coming to the defense of a left-leaning regime in Kabul. Recall that before the Soviet military intervention in Afghanistan during the presidency of Jimmy Carter, 1976 to 1980, that his national security advisor, speaking of Zbigniew Brzezinski, suggested that it would be a neat idea to begin to destabilize the left-leaning regime in Kabul, then cut a deal with religious zealots to who then began to undermine that regime, inviting a Soviet intervention and thereby weakening the Soviet Union, which it did, contributing to the collapse of 1991. But smiles in Washington turned to frowns by September 11, 2001, when Kabul was implicated in terms of the attacks on New York and Washington. Likewise, I think it's premature for the imperialist count to be dancing in the streets and uncorking the champagne bottles in light of recent events in Damascus. We already see that the hawkish Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina has been issuing warnings, finger-wagging warnings to Turkey not to go after the U.S. ally that are the Syrian Kurds who occupy a good deal of northern Syria, for example. It seems to me that it's inevitable that there will be a showdown somehow between Turkey and Washington, because Washington feels Turkey is getting too big for its britches, as they say here in the United States of America. Recall what happened in 2016 when Mr. Erdogan came within a whisker of being overthrown by a coup, thought to be engineered by his NATO allies, speaking of the United States of America, for example. I'm sure that in the Central Intelligence Agency, they're developing plans as we speak to somehow destabilize Mr. Erdogan, who is felt to be too big for his britches. Also, one does not have to be an oracle or a seer to suggest that assuming that rebranded Al-Qaeda establishes a kind of stability in Damascus, that this will have knock-on effects in neighboring Jordan. The king of Jordan, who I've been made to understand speaks Arabic with the strange accent, betraying his closeness to London and to the British, that his population is heavily Palestinian, and that this may contribute to further instability in Jordan. If I'm sitting in Iran today and going back and forth with regard to this nuclear deal, the Joint Comprehensive Program of Action, which was scuttled by the incoming Trump administration, we know that despite Mr. Trump's stated wish to focus like a laser beam on China, it'll be difficult for him to disregard the entreaties of his Zionist backers, of whom there are many, to focus on Iran, for example, because it's felt that the axis of resistance is now on the back foot. This may lead to Iran accelerating the development of nuclear weapons, including delivery mechanisms, including intercontinental ballistic missiles. Now, I'm not suggesting that Iran go down that path, but if you ask the North Koreans, they may be able to tell you that in terms of assuring regime stability, there's nothing like possessing nuclear weapons. And of course, if you look at Libya, when it began to treat the North Atlantic powers as legitimate bargaining powers, partners, and giving up its nuclear facilities, that facilitates the overthrow of Gaddafi, for example. So I mean, I could go on in this vein, but as I said, I think part of the problem with this North Atlantic camp and their leader, the United States of America, is like the corporations that dominate U.S. imperialism. They're involved in very short-term thinking. I mean, it seems impossible for them to think in the long term. Uh, they, they see the overthrow of the multi-confessional secular regime of Mr. Al-Assad as this victory because it was long awaited, for example, and they'll worry about tomorrow, for example. And on the other hand, you could say that this is part of
Kareem, are you still there?
Did we
United.
lose Gerald?
I think
Oh,
so.
here,
Are you there?
I'm here. Hear me?
Ah, okay,
I
you're
hear
back.
you, but your screen is frozen.
Bush was referring to Donald Trump in 2016 as a chaos agent,
Hmm.
which, and obviously he has been a chaos agent. He's been a bull in China shop, as they say. Um, but then the question becomes, is that just a personal peccadillo of Mr. Trump? Or does it reveal something deeper about U.S. imperialism? That is to say, that trapped in this crisis that has few exits that are available, it descends into chaos, or like the old biblical story where I think it was Solomon who brings down the temple uh, because of his not seeing an exit or a way out. And also, you could see this as a product of the false consciousness of U.S. imperialism. It's an inability to see past the current moment and to make projections for the future because it recognizes that the future is dim and grim indeed. And so, obviously, I'm putting a certain spin on events that obviously are quite distressing. That is to say, the coming to power of rebranded Al Qaeda, the fact that in Idlib province, where they had been ruling, women accused of adultery were stoned to death. Beheadings were not uncommon, for example. So it's no way to put a lipstick on this pig. But at the same time, I think it is possible to construct an alternative narrative that portrays what's happening today as just one more chapter and an ongoing story of the diminishing of world imperialism, the diminishing of U.S. imperialism in the first instance, and certainly speaking pragmatically, the latter narrative has the advantage of helping to buck up our optimism and help to convince us that victory is certain, which is surely and certainly is.
And
Yeah, I was.
how do you see? Uh, Go ahead, Peter. Sorry.
Well, no, I was just going to jump in there and say that's something Kareem and I were talking about in the past. How uh, it seems like psychologically one of the reasons why communism was able to spread was that it promised the guarantee of victory, that the march of history is definitely going in this direction. And even if you might face, a incredibly powerful government, you might be executed or imprisoned, etc. You're on the winning team and you can be sure of eventual victory. And then you had, the intellectual critics saying, "Oh my God, that's teleology. You can't do that. That's bad." But I think psychologically that does exactly what you just said. Buck people up and give them confidence and the desire to keep fighting because they're sure of victory. And just as one tiny extra point to add to your larger point about the kind of downward trajectory of imperialism, I think in the economic realm you can see that really clearly because the idea of the US becoming like the world's manufacturing powerhouse again would require so many radical reforms at home that would essentially, remove a lot of parasites out of the U.S. economic system. The parasites being in the form, many forms: finance, healthcare, the health insurance industry, all of which are major campaign donors and are not going to be cut out of, the eating at the trough anytime soon. But that would be what's required if the U.S. is ever going to get anywhere near the level of China's economic dynamism. But it's hard to see that happening. So I tend to agree with you that U.S. imperialism is on a kind of fatal spiral.
Well, sure. And to turn the coin over, you might recall that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Francis Fukuyama, Japanese American neoconservative scholar, now affiliated with Stanford University, wrote an article and a book of the same title, The End of History. That is to say, that we've reached the turning point in global history where capitalism is the victor, with so-called liberal democracy, which I have to say so-called because obviously for the longest it has applied sporadically to some, such as my brothers and sisters, for example. But in any case, that they were the victors. But now, of course, he's revising uh, that particular hypothesis in terms of the rise of China. And I think that if I were to be able to interrogate him on the witness stand relentlessly, I probably could get him to confess that he made a misjudgment decades ago with this thesis about the end of history, that in fact the rise of China leaves in the dust that particular thesis, and that US imperialism made a strategic blunder by building up China on the premise that it would always be this reliable little brother and that its labor, cheap labor, could be exploited indefinitely. That was a significant blunder. And it comes inevitably from the fact that the United States, on the one hand, it has this propaganda line about the marketplace of ideas, freedom of speech, etc. But what happens is that the main organs communicating ideas routinely keep out of the discussion anything that does not comport with the ruling ideology, for example. And therefore, it makes it difficult to question uh, these obvious wrong-headed policies, these boneheaded policies. And so, once again, that's a reflection of the corruption of US imperialism and the downward trajectory of US imperialism.
Yeah, exactly. It reminds me of a conversation we just had on this channel with Michael Hudson, Professor Michael Hudson, about where he also said why Chinese would send their brightest to Ivy League schools in the United States because they will just be propagandized into that failing economic system, and they take that back home to China. And that is actually absolutely true. We teach here in China, and the all these Ivy League students come to us with ideas of this great free market and neoliberalism, and that's all the stuff that they get in the United States. But just to hone in on China a little bit, so we've seen what's happening in West Asia has pretty much drawn in a lot of great powers: Iran, Russia, Turkey, United States, Europe, and China is awfully silent. It's very much in the background. Of course, some nice statements during UN meetings and that kind of stuff. But besides that, China is seems really hands off. Whilst you also see that imperialism is really coming closer and closer also to China. How do you perceive China's role at this moment with regards to U.S. imperialism, specifically in West Asia?
Well, a footnote with regard to your comment about education, higher education. Uh, as part of the legacy of slavery, for example, there's this ongoing battle right now in the United States to purge Black students from Ivy League universities, for example. As a matter of fact, I don't think that it's an exaggeration to suggest that uh, the racists, the descendants of slave owners, would prefer to see the daughter of Xi Jinping admitted to Harvard rather than some Black student from St. Louis, Missouri, for example. I mean, that's part of the contradictions right now of U.S. imperialism. They haven't gotten over the loss of their most valuable investment. Speaking of enslaved Africans, and by the way, on that same point, when the U.S. Supreme Court overthrew these programs that facilitated the admission of Black students into these universities, they carved out an exemption for the military academies, the U.S. Naval Academy, West Point, the Army Academy, and the Air Force Academy. They can continue to recruit Black students, for example.
Yeah.
That was
Cannon
just
fodder,
validated.
that's fine. Cannon fodder, that's fine.
Right, right.
Yeah.
But that's going to reach a crisis because the incoming Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, who is, of course, a Christian warrior, has tattoos lauding the Crusades on his body, for example, which makes it all the more curious that some of our Muslim friends in Michigan decided to vote for Mr. Trump in light of disappointing this Christian warrior who salutes the Crusades as Secretary of Defense. He says whatever the court says, he's going to get rid of those programs at Annapolis, the Naval Academy, West Point, the Army Academy, and the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs. So the jury's still out. But with regard to your point on China, I think China's going to have to get involved because the sly and diabolical Mr. Erdogan also facilitated the transport to the battlefield of Syria of many Uyghurs, for example, from Western China, many Uzbeks from China's neighbors and former Soviet Central Asia. And obviously, this may have the advantage of convincing Mr. Trump that part of his program of focusing like a laser beam on China can also incorporate Syria, because you can train warriors on the battlefield of Syria who can then be transported back to Western China and can create quite a headache for the People's Republic of China. But in any case, I see this China sitting on its hands as being a short-lived process, because already there are rumblings about the Taiwan Straits, for example. And I think that that's going to be the next flashpoint after Ukraine, after Syria, next the Taiwan Straits. And in part, I think it has something to do with the fact of the existence of TSMC, the major chip manufacturer, for example, because there have been stories in the US press that suggest that if China invades Taiwan, and I saw the stories about Chinese naval vessels creeping ever closer to the shores of Taiwan, that TSMC will be destabilized. So that won't be a prize that China can grab, for example. And the United States takes this question of TSMC very seriously because, as you know, as part of the vaunted Inflation Reduction Act, so-called, passed under Mr. Biden in the early months of his administration, it involves subsidies to U.S. chip manufacturers, for example, like Intel. The problem with Intel, the Silicon Valley erstwhile giant, is that it just sacked the CEO. It's a bad investment. It's hemorrhaging cash. And so Intel as a substitute for TSMC, that seems to be a fantasy. Now, TSMC also is building facilities in the United States of America. But interestingly enough, the executives of TSMC, in what could be called an insult to the United States, they say the workers in the United States are not up to snuff. They're not up to speed compared to the workers in Taiwan. But they'll build the facilities anyway because they're massive subsidies from the U.S. government to build these facilities. And in any case, they'll have backup in case China invades Taiwan. And of course, it brings the Taiwanese leadership ever closer to the U.S. leadership, as reflected in the fact that the newly installed Taiwanese leader was just in Hawaii, was just in Guam, another U.S. colony. So I don't really see this lethargy on the part of Beijing as being a permanent fixture in the political landscape because there's too much at stake in Taiwan from the point of view of Beijing and also from the point of view of Washington.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that. I'm tempted to ask more questions, but we are at the hour mark, so perhaps I should save it for next time.
Sounds good.
All right. Thank you so much. That was a great talk, and also I hope that your explanation of a kind of historical context will hearten some people that are currently feeling, a little disheartened.
Yeah.
Well, just tell them to study the U.S.-Turkey relationship. Those that if they were partners, they'd be in marriage counseling right now because they have serious problems that I don't think can be overcome. And so, just looking at the relationship between Ankara and Washington should give one hope.
Okay,
All right.
okay, good. Because in the anti-imperialist spheres, we hear now that and Turkey is the dog of the United States, and one is two how do you say that big buddies with Israel and all that kind of stuff. So these are often very simplistic takes, I guess. Everybody is angry and emotional, but we're definitely gonna keep an eye on how that develops between Turkey and the United States. And let's see, maybe you're right, and we are definitely gonna ask you some questions about it again in the future, Professor Horne.
Oh, please do.
And thanks again for coming, and enjoy the time in Honolulu. And,
oh yes, of course.
And talk to you again.
Yeah, good luck to you.
Thank
All right.
you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.